The kind of cold that settled over the city that January didn't just bite, it burrowed. It found the gaps in old coats and the cracks in old windows, and it stayed there, patient, until it had taken everything warm a person had left. Nora Bennett should have walked past the man collapsed by her building's side door. In this neighborhood, minding your own business wasn't just manners. It was how you stayed alive long enough to see spring. But she didn't walk past him. She dragged a freezing, half-conscious stranger up 2 flights of stairs and into her apartment. By sunrise, he was gone, and the most dangerous man in the city had decided she belonged to him. Nora had worked a double shift at Mercy General, the kind that blurred into a single long gray smear of vital signs and vending machine coffee. And by the time she stepped off the 11:40 bus, her feet had stopped registering the sidewalk beneath them as anything but a dull, distant ache. The wind coming off the river cut sideways through her coat, and she walked with her chin tucked down and her keys laced through her knuckles, the way every woman on this block learned to walk sometime around age 15. The shift itself had been the kind that made her question, not for the first time, why she'd chosen a career that asked her to absorb other people's worst nights as a matter of routine. A construction accident that had taken most of a man's left hand, a domestic dispute that had left a woman's cheek swollen shut around one eye, the woman insisting, the way they so often did, that she'd simply fallen. A teenager brought in seizing from something he'd bought off a stranger outside a gas station, his mother screaming in the hallway loud enough that security had to intervene twice. By the time Nora clocked out, she had stopped feeling much of anything at all, which she had learned, over 4 years of nights like this one, was usually the point where exhaustion became dangerous rather than merely uncomfortable. She turned into the narrow gap between her building and the shuttered laundromat next door, the shortcut she took every night because the front door lock had been broken since October, and the landlord treated maintenance requests like personal insults. That was when she saw the shoe. It was leather, good leather, scuffed at the toe, sticking out from the shadow beside the dumpster. Nora stopped walking. Every instinct she'd built over 6 winters in this neighborhood told her to keep moving, to get inside, lock the door, and let whatever this was resolve itself without her. People did not investigate shapes in alleys. People who wanted to see 40 kept their eyes forward and their mouths shut. Then the shoe twitched, and a low, ragged breath rattled out of the shadow, and Nora, against every rule she had ever taught herself, took a step closer. "Hey," Nora said, her voice thin against the wind. "You alive down there?" No answer came, only another shallow, wet breath. She rounded the dumpster and found a man slumped against the brick, half sunk into a puddle of slush that had already begun to skin over with ice. He wore a heavy dark overcoat, soaked through, and his dark hair was plastered flat against a forehead cut open above one eyebrow. Nora crouched, keeping a careful distance. "Sir, can you hear me?" He didn't answer, but the street lamp caught something dark and glistening spreading beneath his side, something that wasn't just meltwater. The metallic smell of blood cut through the cold, sharp, and unmistakable to anyone who had spent as many years in an emergency room as Nora had. She should have called it in and walked inside. Anonymous tip, warm apartment, someone else's problem by the time an ambulance crawled through icy streets 40 minutes later. That was the sensible math. But Nora had spent 4 years learning exactly what a body did when nobody stopped to help it, and she had never quite managed to unlearn the reflex that came before the sensible math. "Damn it," Nora muttered, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His skin was ice cold, but beneath it, a pulse fluttered, weak and far too fast. Shock, compounded by hypothermia. She had seen this exact combination kill people twice his size. His head lolled toward her, and for a moment she saw his face clearly, sharp jaw, dark lashes, a hard, closed expression even in unconsciousness, like a man who didn't relax even when his body had stopped giving him a choice. "Okay," Nora said, mostly to herself. "You are not dying on my doorstep." Getting him upright was its own small war. He was dead weight, soaked wool doubling whatever he already weighed, and Nora's boots slid twice on the icy pavement before she managed to wedge her shoulder under his arm and haul him vertical. He groaned, a deep, involuntary sound, and his eyes cracked open just enough to catch the streetlight, dark and unfocused. "Walk," Nora ordered. I can't carry you. Use your legs." He didn't understand her. Not really, but something older than language kicked in, some animal instinct toward movement, and his boots began to scrape against the pavement in a shuffling, half-conscious rhythm. Together they staggered the last 10 feet to the service door, Nora fumbling her key one-handed while bracing his shifting weight against her hip. Nora had lived in this building for 4 years, ever since her mother's stroke had eaten through what little savings the family had managed to scrape together, and she had learned early that survival here ran on unspoken rules nobody wrote down, but everybody understood. You didn't make eye contact on the bus after dark. You didn't leave your porch light on, because it only told people you weren't home. And you absolutely did not stop for strangers in alleys, no matter how badly some small, stubborn part of you wanted to. She had broken that last rule exactly twice in 6 years. The first time had been a teenager, overdosing behind the corner store, and she still thought about him sometimes. Wondered if the ambulance had gotten there in time. Wondered if her 5 extra minutes of CPR had mattered at all. The second time was tonight. And some tired, aching part of her already suspected this one would cost her far more than the first. The stairwell smelled like old cabbage and someone's forgotten cigarette, but it was out of the wind, and that alone felt like mercy. It took nearly 10 minutes to get him up 2 flights, both of them slipping twice, Nora's knees scraping raw against the linoleum landing on the 2nd floor before she managed to haul them both upright again. By the time she shoved open the door to apartment 4C, she was drenched in sweat despite the cold, her lungs burning. She dragged him across the threshold, kicked the door shut, and threw the deadbolt before letting him drop onto her kitchen floor. He lay there, entirely still, a dark stain of water and blood beginning to spread slowly across the cracked linoleum. Nora leaned against the door and stared at what she had just done. "Well," she said to the empty apartment, "this is exactly how horror movies start." Part 1. What the blood told her. There was no time to sit with that thought. Panic was a luxury reserved for people whose patients weren't actively bleeding on their kitchen floor, and Nora had never once been able to afford that particular luxury. She stripped off her wet coat, kicked her boots into a corner, and dropped to her knees beside him. Hypothermia would kill him faster than blood loss, so the wet clothes came first. She rolled him onto his back, and his hand shot out with sudden, startling force, closing around her wrist hard enough to grind bone. His eyes had opened. Dark, flat, terrifyingly alert despite blue-tinged lips, and a body that was actively shutting down. "No hospital," he rasped, his voice like gravel dragged over stone. "No hospital. You need a doctor," Nora said, keeping her voice level even as her pulse spiked. "No cops. No hospital." His grip tightened further, and there was no plea in his voice at all, only a flat, absolute command. "Understand." "Fine," Nora said. "No cops, no hospital. Now let go of my wrist before I let you bleed out on my kitchen floor out of spite." He studied her for a long, agonizing second, some calculation moving behind his eyes, and then his hand went slack, dropping away as his eyelids fluttered shut again. Nora rubbed the ache out of her wrist, grabbed a pair of trauma shears from the bag she kept by the door out of habit, and got to work. The coat came off first, cut up the sleeves to spare him unnecessary movement. Beneath it, a ruined, blood-soaked shirt, and beneath that, the damage. A long, jagged laceration along his left ribs, the kind left by a blade, not a bullet. Deep, but it had missed anything vital. His torso was a map of old bruises, fading yellow, beside fresh ones, blooming dark purple. The record of a man whose body took punishment as a matter of routine. She fetched what passed for a medical kit from her bathroom, rubbing alcohol, a curved needle, a spool of heavy thread she kept for exactly this kind of emergency. A habit left over from an ex, who used to say her apartment looked more like a field hospital than a home. She pressed a towel to the wound and held it there through 5 long minutes until the bleeding slowed to a manageable ooze, then cleaned the edges and threaded the needle with hands that had gone steady out of sheer necessity. He woke on the 3rd stitch, eyes snapping open, a hand flying up to close around her throat. Nora froze. The needle stayed exactly where it was. "You're awake," she said, her voice remarkably even considering the circumstances. He stared at her, chest heaving, taking in the needle, the bloody towel, the cracked yellow cabinets behind her. "What are you doing?" "Keeping your insides from becoming your outsides," Nora said. "You're cut badly. If you strangle me, I can't finish, and you'll ruin my floor worse than you already have." He studied her the way you'd study a lock you were deciding whether to trust, his thumb pressing lightly against her pulse point, reading her heartbeat the way another man might read a face. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. His hand slid away, dropping back to the floor. "Do you have anything to drink?" he asked. "Cheap vodka in the freezer." "That's it. Get it." She tied off the stitch, retrieved the bottle, and handed it over without a glass. He drank like a man who had done far worse things sober, and didn't so much as wince at the burn. "Keep going," he said, handing it back. For the next 20 minutes the only sounds in the apartment were the radiator ticking, wind against the window, and the quiet drag of thread through skin. He didn't make another sound. When she finally tied off the last knot, and taped a square of gauze over the row of stitches, he shifted upright on one elbow, surveying her apartment. The peeling wallpaper, the stack of unpaid bills weighted under a chipped mug, the single second-hand armchair by the window. "You live here alone?" he asked. "None of your business." He looked at her properly for the first time, without blood or ice obscuring his face. Sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes so dark brown they read almost black. There was no warmth in any of it. He looked like a machine someone had forgotten to switch off. "You shouldn't have brought me in here," he said quietly. "Next time I find a man dying in my alley, I'll remember that." Nora shot back, exhaustion sharpening her voice more than she intended. "You were freezing to death. I'm a nurse. It's an occupational hazard." She stood, gathering the bloody towels into a garbage bag. "You can take the couch. If you steal my television, I will hunt you down and pull those stitches out with my teeth." Something that might have been a laugh, dry and rusty, escaped him. "Your television is an antique. It's safe." "What's your name?" Nora asked, surprising herself with the question. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Damien," he finally said. "Well, Damien, try not to bleed on my couch cushions. They're the only ones I own." "I'll do my best," he said, and there was something almost human in the dryness of it, some flicker of a person underneath the machinery. "Why were you in that alley?" she asked. "Really, someone tried to make sure I wasn't going to be a problem anymore," Damien said. "They were less thorough than they should have been." "Are they going to come looking for you here?" "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight, whoever did this thinks I'm already dead in a ditch somewhere. That buys us until morning at least." "Us," Nora repeated. "There's no us. There's you, bleeding on my floor, and me, wondering what I just dragged into my apartment." "Fair," Damien said, and closed his eyes again, the conversation apparently over as far as he was concerned. She tossed him a worn fleece blanket and retreated to her bedroom, locking a door she knew wouldn't stop him if he wanted in. She was too tired to care. She was asleep before her head finished hitting the pillow. Part 2. The empty apartment. Nora woke to hard winter light cutting through the gap in her blinds, her mouth tasting of old coffee and copper. For one disoriented second, she thought the previous night had been some stress fever dream, and then her knees throbbed, and she remembered the blood on the floor. She listened. Silence. No radiator hiss, no breathing from the other room. She grabbed a heavy wooden hanger from her closet as a pitiful weapon and crept out. The apartment was empty. The fleece blanket sat folded into a neat square on the arm of the couch. The garbage bag of ruined clothes was gone. The kitchen floor had been scrubbed clean. No trace left but the faint smell of iodine and wet wool. Nora lowered the hanger, feeling relief and, absurdly, a flicker of disappointment in equal measure. She went to make coffee and stopped halfway to the counter. Sitting beside her stack of overdue bills was a thick banded stack of $100 bills, and beneath it, a plain cream-colored business card with nothing printed on it but a single phone number embossed in black ink. She stared at the money without touching it, the way you'd stare at something that might be radioactive. $10,000, maybe more. She thought of every movie she'd ever seen where a stack of cash like this appeared on a counter, and none of the endings in those movies were good ones. For a moment she considered simply throwing it away, the card too, pretending the entire night had been a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and too much cold. But some practical, exhausted part of her brain was already doing the math on what $10,000 could mean. Her mother's physical therapy bills, the security deposit on an apartment with a front door that actually locked, the used car she'd been putting off for 2 winters because the bus schedule ate 3 extra hours out of every week she had. She hated herself a little for even entertaining it, and she left the money exactly where it sat anyway, unable to decide whether that made her honest or simply a coward putting off a decision. She crossed to the window, The storm had broken overnight, leaving the street buried under a thick, pristine snow that nobody had plowed yet. Parked directly across from her building, engine idling, exhaust curling into the cold morning air, was a black SUV, with windows tinted nearly black. As she watched, the driver's window cracked an inch, and a thin plume of cigarette smoke drifted out. Nora yanked the blinds shut and pulled up the local news on her phone with shaking fingers. The headline read, "Syndicate Power Struggle Turns Bloody, 6 Dead in Docklands Ambush, Fate of New Boss Unknown." She scrolled, scanning faster than she could properly process the words. A rival faction had made a move against the newly installed head of the city's largest organized crime family. A shootout, an ambush, authorities uncertain whether the man himself had survived the night. There was a file photo attached. It was him. Hair slicked back, a bespoke suit, no blood, but the same flat, dark eyes staring back at her from the screen. The caption read, "Damien Voss, presumed head of the Voss Syndicate." Nora set the phone down slowly, the room tilting slightly around her. She hadn't saved a random victim of the city's violence. She had saved its architect. A hard knock at her door made her jump so violently she nearly dropped the phone. "Miss Bennett?" a voice called from the hallway, brisk and official. "Detective Ray Coulter, City PD. Open up, please." Part 3, The Detective. Nora shoved the cash and the card to the bottom of her flour canister before she answered, burying them under a mound of white powder. With hands that only shook a little, she undid the chain but left the deadbolt thrown, opening the door 2 inches. Detective Ray Coulter looked exactly like a man who had spent the entire winter being disappointed by his city. Gray around the eyes, a rumpled coat that had given up holding a crease years ago, a badge hanging crooked against a cheap striped tie. "Nora Bennett?" he asked. "Yes. Can I help you, detective? Mind if I step in?" "Actually I do," Nora said. "I worked a 16-hour shift. I've had 3 hours of sleep. Whatever this is, it can happen in the hallway." Coulter didn't push, just pulled a small notepad from his coat. "Fair enough. We got a call about blood in the alley behind this building. Trail leads right up to your service door. I came through the front. Front lock's busted. Has been for a week. That's why I lock my own door." Coulter's eyes drifted over the narrow strip of apartment visible through the gap, and he took a slow breath through his nose. "Smells like iodine in there." "I'm a nurse," Nora said, without missing a beat. "I brought home a pair of scrubs soaked in betadine after a chest tube insertion. They're in my laundry basket." He studied her hands next, scrubbed clean, but knuckles raw from harsh soap. "See anything last night? Anybody hanging around? Anybody bleeding?" "At 3 in the morning, if I saw someone bleeding in that alley, I'd have kept walking," Nora said, letting a bitter edge creep into her voice. "I fix people on my table at Mercy. I don't go looking for them in the dark." It was, she thought distantly, the perfect lie. Because it was exactly what 6 years in this neighborhood should have taught anyone to say. Coulter nodded slowly, apparently satisfied by the cynicism of it. "Words out there was a shakeup across town last night. A lot of lead in the air. New head of the Voss family took a hit. Nobody's sure if he's alive or hiding. If he's hiding, he'll be looking for a hole to crawl into. I'll keep an eye out," Nora said. "You do that." Coulter flipped his notebook shut. "Keep your chain on, Miss Bennett." He turned and walked back down the hallway, his heavy shoes scuffing against worn linoleum. Nora shut the door, threw the deadbolt, and slid down the wood until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. $10,000. A blank card. A man who had left her building without a trace and left a black SUV watching her window instead. She wasn't a good Samaritan anymore. She was a loose thread in something enormous. And someone, somewhere, had already started pulling. Her coworker Denise called that afternoon, her voice pitched with the particular urgency of someone who had already heard 3 different versions of a rumor before lunch. "There's a cop asking about you at the nurse's station," Denise said. "Wanted to know your shift schedule. Said it was routine." "Nothing about you is routine, Nora, and you know it." "It's nothing," Nora said, hating how thin the lie sounded even to her own ears. "Nothing doesn't make Ray Coulter show up in person," Denise said. "You know who that is, right? He's not regular beat. People say he does side work for people who don't like paperwork." Nora's stomach dropped. "What kind of side work?" "The kind where debts get collected in ways that don't involve a courthouse," Denise said. "Whatever you've gotten tangled up in, Nora, be careful." "Please," Nora promised she would, and hung up feeling the walls of her life narrowing around her by the hour, the way a hallway does right before it turns into somewhere you never meant to go. Part 4. The Man in the Supply Closet. For 3 days, nothing happened, which was somehow worse than something happening. Nora went to work. She rode the bus. She stared at the flour canister every time she reached for coffee and left the money exactly where it was, because touching it would have meant admitting all of it was real. She told herself, repeatedly, that the SUV had simply moved on, that whoever had been watching her building had grown bored or been reassigned, that the strange, cold week she'd just lived through was already becoming someone else's problem. She almost believed it by the third night. Then, on the fourth night, a man walked into supply room B while she was counting inventory. He wasn't wearing scrubs. A cheap leather jacket, a thick gold chain, a chipped front tooth bared in something that wasn't quite a smile. He stepped inside and let the heavy fire door swing shut behind him with a metallic click that made Nora's stomach drop straight through the floor. "You Nora?" he asked. "Name's Ray, friend of Detective Coulter's. He mentioned you had yourself a busy weekend. Patients aren't allowed back here," Nora said, her voice wavering despite her best effort. "Waiting rooms down the hall. I ain't a patient, sweetheart." He took another step, closing the distance, the smell of stale smoke and cheap cologne rolling ahead of him. "My employers are missing a man, bled out bad in an alley behind your building. Then he just vanishes. And you, a nurse who knows how to close a wound, happen to live right there. Now maybe you're just a good citizen, or maybe you know exactly where that man's hiding." "I don't know what you're talking about," Nora said, backing into the wire shelving, saline bags shifting behind her with a dull slosh. "See, that's the thing," Ray said, ignoring her entirely. "I don't actually care whether you're lying to me right now. My employers just want an answer, any answer, and I get paid the same whether you give it to me nicely or the other way." His eyes flicked over her, cataloging, the way a man sizes up furniture he's about to move. "So let's try this again. Where's Damien Voss?" "I don't know anyone by that name." He reached out and closed a hand around her upper arm, hard enough that she gasped. "Here's the thing. If I gotta come find you again, I won't be asking nice." Pain flared white-hot through her shoulder as his grip tightened, and her free hand, scrabbling blindly along the shelf behind her, closed around something heavy and solid, the Sharps disposal box. She swung it without thinking, catching him hard across the temple. He grunted, stumbled, and Nora shoved past him, yanking the fire door open and bolting down the hallway without looking back. She didn't stop until she'd thrown herself into the employee locker room and slammed the door shut behind her, chest heaving, listening for footsteps that never came. Her arm throbbed, 4 dark fingerprints already blooming beneath her sleeve. She was out of time and out of options. With shaking hands, she dug the blank business card out of her bag. She'd taken to carrying it after the second day, some instinct refusing to let it stay buried in flour, and dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it. It rang once. "Speak," said a low, resonant voice, stripped of everything but a kind of controlled iron. It was him. "He found me," Nora said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A man named Ray. He grabbed me in a supply closet. Coulter sent him." There was a fraction of a second of silence, cold enough that Nora felt it through the phone line itself. "Are you hurt?" Damien asked. His voice carried no panic at all, only a terrible, clinical calm. "He grabbed my arm. I hit him with a Sharps box. I can't go back out there, and I can't go home. Listen to me carefully," Damien said, and something in the steadiness of his voice forced her own racing heart into a slower rhythm. "Walk out the south exit by the loading dock. There's a blind spot in the cameras by the dumpsters. You have 4 minutes. Go." The line went dead. Part 5. The alley behind the loading dock. Nora didn't stop to change out of her scrubs. She grabbed her bag and moved, keeping her head down through the back corridors, past a startled orderly with a laundry cart, out through the heavy metal doors, into air that hit her like a slap. The loading dock was dark, lit by a single flickering bulb. She counted the longest 4 minutes of her life standing in the shadow of the dumpsters, teeth chattering, certain at every second that Ray had followed her after all. Then tires hissed against wet pavement, and a black SUV without headlights rolled into the alley like something predatory, stopping inches from her. The rear door swung open. "Get in!" a voice said from the dark interior. Nora didn't hesitate. The door shut behind her with a heavy, pressurized thud, sealing out the cold entirely. The interior smelled of leather and something faintly like cedar, warm in a way that felt almost violent after the alley outside. Damien Voss sat beside her, and he looked nothing like the half-dead man she'd dragged up 2 flights of stairs 4 days earlier. His suit was dark and tailored, his jaw clean-shaven, a neat surgical strip covering the cut above his eyebrow. He looked, unmistakably, like power, but his eyes were exactly the same, dark and flat, and reading her without apology. His gaze dropped to the bruise blooming on her arm, and something tightened along his jaw, the only crack in an otherwise unreadable face. "I told Finn I didn't want to be involved," Nora said, her voice shaking with leftover adrenaline. "I told you to leave me alone." "You did," Damien said. "Coulter forced the issue. He sold your name to clear a gambling debt. So what happens now? Do I get an apology? A plane ticket? Your life, as you knew it, ended the moment you decided to save a stranger in an alley," Damien said. Not unkindly, but without softening it either. "Everyone who wanted me dead now knows your name too. You can't go back to your apartment. You can't go back to Mercy. You don't get to decide that. I'm the only reason you still have a life to make decisions about," he said. And something in the flatness of his voice told her he wasn't exaggerating. That man wasn't there to ask questions. He was there to find out what I'd told you, and then make sure you never told anyone else. Nora stared at him, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, settling dread. "Why does any of this matter to you?" "I stitched a cut. That's it. That's the whole transaction. It stopped being a transaction the moment you refused to leave me in that alley," Damien said quietly. "I've had a great many people owe me their lives, Nora. None of them ever gave anything away for free. You didn't know who I was. You still helped. That doesn't mean I want to be owned by you in return. I'm not asking you to be owned," he said. "I'm telling you what's true. The people who came after me will assume you know things you don't. That makes you a target, whether either of us wants it or not." She had seen the look in Ray's eyes. She knew, somehow, that Damien was telling the truth. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. He reached across the seat and draped a heavy cashmere blanket over her shoulders. Instead of answering directly, "We're going somewhere safe. Until this is finished, you belong under my protection." Part 6. The Glass Fortress. The elevator rose in near total silence, the digital readout ticking past floor after floor until it stopped at 40. The doors slid open onto a penthouse that made Nora's chest ache with its sheer, cold vastness, floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the entire glittering sprawl of the city below, dark slate floors, a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of pressure. "Finn will bring your things tomorrow," Damien said, moving toward a black marble kitchen island, his steps stiffer than they had been in the car. "I don't need anything from my apartment," Nora said. "Because I'm not staying." He stopped. One hand braced against the counter, and for a fraction of a second his shoulders hitched, a flinch, quickly hidden. "You are staying," he said. "We covered this in the car." "You decided that, in the car," Nora corrected, walking toward him, her fear giving way to the same cold pragmatism that got her through 12-hour trauma shifts. "I never agreed. I'm not a piece of property to be stashed in a vault." "Would you rather be dead?" Damien asked, and for the first time something raw slipped through the flat control of his voice. "Because that's the actual choice, Nora. Not comfort versus captivity. Alive in a room you don't like, or dead in an alley somewhere because I let you walk out my door tonight to prove a point about autonomy." "Don't do that," Nora snapped. "Don't make this sound like you're the only reasonable option in the room." "I'm not the only option," Damien said. "I'm the only one who's actually here, offering you a choice instead of a bullet." She didn't have an answer for that, not one that held up against the plain, ugly truth of it, and the silence between them stretched long enough that he turned to face her fully, and under the harsh overhead light, she saw how pale he'd gone. He didn't argue further. He simply unbuttoned his jacket, wincing as his left arm extended, and let it fall over a bar stool. His dress shirt was soaked through with fresh blood, a dark stain spreading over his ribs. "You tore the stitches," Nora said flatly, all her anger evaporating under sheer clinical instinct. "Busy afternoon," Damien said. "A disagreement over shipping routes required a physical presence." "You're an idiot," Nora said, already moving. "Where's your first aid kit?" "Master bath, second door." She found a fully stocked trauma bag under the sink, the kind meant for a man who planned for bullets, not paper cuts. Back in the kitchen, she snapped on gloves and set to work, peeling away the ruined bandage, cleaning the wound, threading a fresh needle while he sat rigid on the bar stool, breathing through his nose in slow, measured counts. "You didn't go to a real doctor," she said. "Couldn't risk a paper trail, not with half the department compromised. So you just taped yourself up and walked into a shootout." He didn't answer that, only watched her hands with a kind of fixed, unblinking attention as she worked. It struck her, not for the first time, how strange this was, the most dangerous man in the city, sitting utterly still, surrendering completely to a stranger's needle. "Coulter gave them my name," Nora said quietly, tying off the first stitch. "Coulter is a symptom," Damien said. "A gambler who owed the wrong people $200,000. They offered to clear his debt if he found the man bleeding in that alley. And Ray?" Damien's expression shifted, the neutrality dropping away into something colder. "Ray put his hands on what belongs to me." "That will not happen again. I don't belong to you," Nora said, tying off the last knot harder than necessary. "I patched you up. I saved your life. That makes us even. It doesn't make me your property. You keep saying that word. Even." Damien watched her hands as she taped the fresh dressing into place. "I don't think you understand what it costs to be even with a man like me. There's no clean transaction here, Nora. No ledger where a stitched wound cancels out an obsession." "Is that what this is? An obsession?" "I haven't found a better word for it," he admitted, and something in the plainness of the admission unsettled her more than any threat could have. "I've had people devote years to earning my trust, and never gotten within a mile of what you did in one night. Without meaning to, without trying to gain anything from it at all." "Maybe that's exactly why it worked," Nora said. "I wasn't trying to gain anything. I just didn't want to watch you die in my alley." He looked down at the fresh bandage, then up at her, and didn't move away. "You don't survive my world by being even, Nora. You survive by holding the high ground. They know you dragged me out of the snow. If I let you walk out that door tonight, they'll use you to get to me. So I stay in the glass box. You stay where I can see you," Damien said, "until I finish what they started." Part 7. What Damien Burned Down. For 4 days, Nora lived inside a strange, suspended quiet. Finn, a broad-shouldered man with a broken nose and unreasonably calm eyes, brought her clothes, her toothbrush, the paperback she'd left on her nightstand, and, eventually, the flour canister itself, the money untouched inside it. "You didn't take any of it," Finn observed, setting the canister down on the counter. "It's not mine," Nora said. "He'll tell you it is. He's stubborn about things like that." "Is he always like this?" Nora asked. "Cold, I mean. Like he's reading a report instead of talking to a person." Finn considered the question longer than she expected. "He wasn't always. I've worked for him 8 years. There was a time he laughed more than he does now. His father ran things before him. And his father wasn't a man who left room for softness in a son who was going to inherit all this." Damien learned early that anything soft got used against him. Eventually. "That sounds lonely." "It is," Finn agreed simply. "I think that's part of why he hasn't put you on a plane out of state yet, even though it would be the smart move. Smart isn't always what wins out with him, not since the alley anyway." He left before Nora could ask what that meant exactly, and she spent the rest of the afternoon turning the conversation over in her mind, the way she turned over most things she didn't yet know what to do with. Damien was rarely there. He left before sunrise, and returned long after she'd fallen asleep in the guest room, and when she did catch him, he was almost always on the phone, his voice low and urgent, directing a war she never saw directly. The news carried fragments of it instead: a warehouse fire on the south side, a shooting outside a steakhouse, an explosion at a shipping yard, all of it labeled a turf war by anchors who had no idea they were describing a controlled demolition. On the 4th night, the storm finally broke. Nora was in the dark living room when the elevator chimed, and Damien stepped out looking like a man who had barely survived the war he'd started, not won it. His coat was soaked through with rain, his lip split, a fresh bruise darkening along one cheekbone, his knuckles split and bleeding. She was on her feet before she decided to move, crossing the room to him without thinking about the blood or the smell of smoke still clinging to his coat. "Sit down," Nora said, already reaching for him. "Let me look at you." "It's done," he said, not moving, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Their leadership is gone, their territories absorbed, the streets quiet." "And Ray?" Nora asked. "He won't be grabbing anyone in a supply closet again," Damien said, and something in the flatness of it told her exactly what that meant, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she wasn't as horrified as she should have been. It wasn't approval. It was simply the cold, unavoidable shape of the world he lived in, laid bare in front of her. She guided him to a bar stool anyway, checking the split in his lip, the bruise along his cheekbone, her hands moving with the same clinical efficiency they always did, even now, even after everything. "You didn't have to come back here looking like this," Nora said. "You could have sent Finn to tell me it was over. I wanted you to hear it from me," Damien said. "Not secondhand, not through someone else's version of what happened. Finn has an envelope downstairs," Damien continued. "A new name, a new life, a house upstate, quiet, safe. You could leave tonight and never look over your shoulder again." Nora thought of her old apartment, the broken lock, the hissing radiator, the endless double shifts patching up a city that never thanked her for it. She thought of the man standing in front of her, who had ordered a war to keep her breathing. "And if I stay?" she asked. Damien went very still. "If you stay, you don't get to look away from what I am. I'm not a good man, Nora. I'm not going to pretend to be one for your comfort. I didn't look away when you were bleeding in my kitchen," Nora said, holding his gaze steady. "I'm not going to start now." Something in him seemed to loosen, just slightly. A tension she hadn't realized he was holding finally slipping free. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the rain still clinging to his coat. "This is different," he said quietly. "You stitched a stranger. This is choosing to stand in the dark with a man who put half a family in the ground." "The dark doesn't scare me," Nora said. "I work nights." A slow breath left him, something close to relief, and his hand rose to rest against the side of her face, careful despite the raw, split knuckles. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He simply rested his forehead against hers and breathed her in, the freezing stranger from the alley gone for good, and the man who remained standing quietly, finally, in a life he had never expected to want this badly. Epilogue. 6 months later. The penthouse had changed in small ways nobody outside it would have noticed. A second-hand armchair sat by the window now, mismatched and worn, the one thing Nora had refused to let Finn replace with something new. A chipped mug sat on the counter most mornings, the same one from her old kitchen, rescued from a box she'd finally allowed to be brought over. Damien still left before sunrise most days, but he came home earlier now, and some evenings he simply sat across the counter while she cooked, watching her with an attention that had nothing calculating left in it at all. "You could have any chef in the city," Damien said one night, watching her burn garlic in a pan she refused to replace. "I could," Nora agreed. "But you'd have to eat alone." He didn't answer that, only reached over and stole a piece of bread straight off the cutting board, and Nora swatted his hand away out of pure habit, the way she might have done to anyone else in her life before either of them had understood what he was. "Denise still asks about you," Nora said, plating the pasta. "Every shift. I think she's convinced you're going to show up at Mercy one day and cause a scene." "Would that be so terrible? You in a waiting room full of my coworkers?" "Absolutely terrible. Wonderful, but terrible." He smiled at that, a small, unguarded thing that had become less rare over the months, though it still caught her off guard every time it happened, like weather that hadn't quite become predictable yet. "I went back to the old building last week," Nora said, setting 2 plates on the counter, "just to see it. They finally fixed the front door lock." "I know," Damien said. "I paid for it." "Of course you did." She shook her head, though there was no real irritation in it anymore, only the tired fondness of someone who had stopped being surprised by this particular habit months ago. "You can't just let ordinary things happen without your hand somewhere in them, can you?" "Not when they matter to you," he said simply, and the honesty of it disarmed her more than any grand gesture could have. The city outside the glass had gone quiet in the particular way cities do when the worst of the danger has passed, at least for now. Somewhere below, an ambulance wailed toward Mercy General, and Nora's eyes flicked toward the sound out of old instinct before she caught herself and let it go, the way she'd slowly learned to let go 100 small fears she used to carry alone. She thought sometimes about the version of herself who had stood frozen over a boot, sticking out from behind a dumpster, deciding whether to walk away. She never regretted the choice she'd made that night, even on the hardest days, even knowing everything it had cost her. She had walked past worse men in worse alleys and never once looked back. It had taken exactly one freezing stranger, bleeding out behind a dumpster on the coldest night of the year, to teach her that some things were worth stopping for, no matter what they turned out to cost. "Stay," Damien said quietly, watching her across the counter. the word carrying more weight than its single syllable should have been able to hold. "I'm not going anywhere," Nora said, and meant it completely. If Nora and Damien's story kept you hooked till the end, hit that like button and let us know. We put everything into telling grounded, deeply human stories about danger, loyalty, and the strangers who change everything. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next release. Share this with someone who loves a good redemption arc, and drop a comment telling us what you would have done: step over him or drag him inside.